been hunter all my life, or as long as I can remember. My father was a hunter, my grandfather was a hunter. I grew up around logging camps and so forth in mid-north coast, and been using firearms for as long as I can remember anyway. I met a young lady up in Darwin who was quite sweet on, and I went down to meet her parents in Victoria. Her dad was a very keen sambar hunter and a member of the ADA, and he actually signed me up just after my 21st birthday in 1988, 89, somewhere around about then. They formed a branch in New South Wales, and I transferred across to that. I became the president of the branch and state president of the way ADA is set up about 6 months later, and I've been very heavily involved with the ADA ever since. At the first meeting of ADA when it was formed, I walked into the room and I didn't know anyone, but I very definitely wanted to get involved in the future of hunting. I'd just come off the issue with the Unsworth gun ban or attempted ban, and I felt so powerless throughout that whole process because we were being targeted. I was going to lose my guns, we were all going to lose our guns. I felt helpless, completely helpless. And when the ADA started up in New South Wales, they had a very proud history down in Victoria and South Australia and other places of fighting the good fight politically. And I volunteered for the only position I could get, which was representative of a group that had had its first meeting and coming up to its second meeting, which they were loosely calling the Joint Committee of Recreational Hunting Associations of New South Wales, which I thought that had to have a pretty fair history because its name almost sounded like a job description. So I went along to the first meeting of that, or my first meeting, their second meeting, and found out very quickly that the concept of Joint Committee Recreational Hunting Associations was thought up by a guy called Don Brooks, and this was the first of the public meetings. At that first meeting they determined that they should have a chairman, and that was a gentleman called Ron Thomas, and Don took the position of secretary. So at their second meeting, my first meeting, we were outlaying what we thought were the goals and objectives of what we should work to. So Don had some very clear ideas as to what he wanted to do. He was under the impression that that we couldn't set ourselves up like a group that existed in Victoria at the time, which was the Shooting Sports Council of Victoria. It was set up on the basis of 1 vote per 1,000 members. So the Sporting Shooters Association was the biggest group, and it had enough votes to basically outvote everybody else in the room if it ever came to a vote on something. Don, or his goal, his belief in setting that up was that it would be 1 vote per organisation, irrespective of how big that organisation was, because, and he was very, very clear on this, what you got then was you got people coming along because they were motivated to be there. They brought their brains into the room and left their egos at the door, because the organisations weren't big enough to have that big, egotistical, bombastic look or view of the world that large groups did. That did not meet with the initial approval of SSAA in New South Wales, because they were looking to model this on the Victorian model, which is why they never joined. One of the things that there was quite a lot of synergy between Don and myself as the ADA representative in the room. Don was of the opinion that what counted was the result. What was not that important was who actually got the result. And that was quite unique at that point in time, and that was definitely the way that I was thinking. I didn't care who got the win. The important thing was that we got a win. Trying to claim the kudos for a win seemed to me a fairly hollow victory. What was important was the win. If you focused on the win and you kept the internal politics, the internal egos out of it, then that benefited everyone. Don spent a year as secretary. He then stood down. I took over from him as the secretary of the Joint Committee of Recreational Hunting Associations, and during that time we when I say we, myself and the then Vice Chairman, a man called Gary Flynn, wrote a constitution and went through the process of incorporating the Joint Committee, Recreation and Hunting Associations. We also, in those early years, with the assistance of two gentlemen from the Fire and Sports Association, Chris Buckley and Chris Blanchard, they effectively wrote a draft bill and a proposal for public land hunting, which met with my immediate support. And as Secretary, I went back and typed all that up. We submitted that to Joint Committee and then went through that to make sure all the member clubs and associations were happy with that. We then took that to Forestry and got quite a cool reception at the time. And then we took it to government and got a bit of a cool reception on that one as well, but at least we tried. That was the first effort that I'm aware of in New South Wales of anyone trying to get public land opened up for hunting. That would have been early 90s. It was amazing how some of the other delegates started to change the way they thought after, and it took months of debate and months of discussion on this, and it was fairly obvious after about 18 months, 2 years of that the majority of the delegates coming to not GameCon then, but Joint Committee Recreational Associations then, were very much starting to line up with me that we needed to fight for our rights. Nobody else was going to do it. We were sick and tired of being stood on, and what we needed was a critical mass of some means to actually make that happen. A group of us were down in Victoria and Wanagata Station around a campfire, and we were basically talking about how good the Victorians had it and about whether in fact, someone jokingly said, you know, we may as well move to Victoria because we're never going to get anything going right for us in New South Wales. And you couldn't really argue with that at the time because you know, Victoria was light years ahead of us. So we started to talk, and there's some really good ideas started to come up, and I went back to my car and I got one of those big brown, you know, the big brown paper bags that you get your McDonald's stuff in, and we ripped one of them open and somebody managed to scavenge up a stub of a pencil, and we just started writing stuff down. And we started writing down a council run by hunters, hunter education process. We started, at that point in time, the legislation wasn't there that tied you down to the point we needed written permissions, yep. But it was going to be very, very close to what Victoria was doing. That then gave us, when it came back and thinking about that, reflecting on that, gave a degree of direction. So we then started, we being the ADA as members of Joint Committee Recreational Hunting Association, started to push that. And it was quite amazing when you actually started going back to the delegates, the other organisations, with very clear things. We need to do A, B, C, D and E. How many of them suddenly said, okay, fair cop, we'll back you on that. So it was, you know, the general talking of the concept, everyone was in that, but as soon as you started to come back with the specifics and timelines of how we thought we could achieve it, people climbed on board with that very, very quickly. What I guess gave me an advantage over all of the others is that when I would go to an ADA national conference, and I went a few times to ADA Victorian State Conference, they were very, very professional. They'd been in a political lobbying process for quite a number of years. Their process, their professionalism that they brought to everything that they did back then, which is why they were winning a lot of battles. Because I was a member of a national body, a lot of ideas, and I've got to tell you, a lot of them were coming straight out of the big groups in Victoria and bringing them back. And once we started to bring those in, people understood the logic of that straight away. And this, you know, the delegates at Joint Committee decided to become GameCon, jumped in behind that and supported that 100%. Well, what happened then was that Robert Brown, who, I guess if you were to tag a percentage on this, is probably public land hunting in New South Wales would be probably 90% Robert Brown. And that's probably been a little unfair to him on 90% because there's probably more than that. Robert went off and did the other side of the coin. My job was to get the clubs lined up and keep them lined up through Joint Committee and then GameCon. His job was to really the hard yards, which was winning the political fight. And he took that up through the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party as they are now, and John Tingle. And John was a very effective politician, one of the most effective that I've seen, and he was able to go through the various departments in the government and actually get finally to the point where Richard Amery, who was the minister at the time, tabled legislation largely written by Robert, and that is what got us a game council once that was passed and through, and we've ended up with our public land hunting. It was the push for the public land hunting that actually pushed the name change, because what we were looking at was the management of game in New South Wales. That was another concept we were pushing very hard about, how we managed our deer in New South Wales, and that was largely put up by Blonde Bay, because they were starting to manage hog deer in Victoria, but you know, could we do that as a concept here in New South Wales? So the discussion came about from a whole heap of different views. So, and then we also came up with the fact that the Joint Committee, the name was too long. So a debate was then started about what would be a better name. And the end objective was the management of our deer herds in New South Wales. We wanted deer as a game animal. That was a very early objective set for Joint Committee, and it made perfect sense that we would become the Game Management Council of Australia. And when we amended the Constitution to that, I remember putting in there all of the aspects of how we would have interstate branches, because I figured it would be a national organisation. And in the review of that Constitution, that was all removed and put back to just effectively there'd only ever be one GameCon Australia, as we abbreviated it to. And then we changed the name and off we went from there. And I guess we would never have become the Game Management Council of Australia had we not had Blonde Bay and the management of deer as a game animal in Victoria, the desire to manage game animals here in New South Wales, and our process of trying to get public land hunting here in New South Wales as well. Yes, Robert Brown got involved in the Shooters and Fishers Party very, very early. And he was definitely working with Tingle at that point in time. Robert was also regularly attending the GameCon meetings. He was at that point in time the state president of the Australian Deer Association, New South Wales state president. And all of that was tying in quite well, because Robert was starting to get the same kind of education that I was getting from ADA in Victoria with the professionalism and so forth that they brought to things. And by degrees we were lifting the professionalism the clubs worked on in New South Wales, and to get their eyes out of the boat, to really have people focused on the fact that the win was the big thing. Who won it was not the big thing. And we were succeeding in that in leaps and bounds. So when Robert went off with John Tingle and they started to draft legislation, they started to work the internals of Parliament House to get that up and running. The link was already clearly established between what we're trying to achieve, or what Robert was achieving through the Shooters and Fishers Party, and the support from the hunting organisations that were members of GameCon. The two of those went hand in hand. So Robert would come back and report to us fairly regularly. We had to be very careful though at that point in time, because a key plank of our strategy was that we had to keep, I suppose, we just not tell AA. We couldn't afford to. They were working on a process at that point. Roy Smith was with State Forests of buying access to forests for their members, and Pilliga was the first one that they actually did that with. And as Roy admitted to me when he was on the Game Council years later at the Education and Training Subcommittee, that had they known what we were doing and how successful we were getting at it, they would have campaigned against it, because what they seen it at the time was just more regulation, more restrictions on people's right to own firearms and to hunt. Now, 12, 18 months after he joined the Game Council, Roy had a very different opinion of that because he understood where we were coming from. But it was like wedge politics. We brought the bill in, had the bill passed with the SSAA having a seat, and the idea was that they then couldn't complain because they were actually part of the organisation unless they wanted to surrender their seat. So it was a little bit of wedge politics in that, which worked for us very well at the time. But the main person who actually got that up and running without a doubt was Robert Brown. One of the things that John Tingle did, and did extremely well when he got into Parliament, was that he used the friendships he already had. I think he used to give Bob Carr his media training, so he used the contacts he already had to not put himself offside with them. He would vote with the government, he supported the government, and then when he actually went to them and said, I want this particular thing, he wasn't seen as an enemy, he wasn't seen as someone they couldn't work with. He was seen as someone that they probably owed something to. So John's ability to work that internal political process was instrumental in that. Now, yes, Robert did most of the hard work on that, but I've got to tell you, if we'd had somebody other than Tingle in the lead up to that, somebody with a different attitude, how they approached, how they dealt, interfaced or interacted with their colleagues in the House, we wouldn't have got past square one. There were a number of other things we were doing in the background while we were working towards that. One of the big things, in fact one of the things that delayed us quite a bit was 1996, was Howard's gun laws. As a hunting community we're fairly united as to what we wanted to push on that. Government obviously just had a mass shooting, so they then became very nervous about people using guns on public land, and that set us back quite a bit. And once again, I've got to take my hat off to John Tingle because he was actually able to work with them to get that perception turned around, and that you cannot understate how well he did or how good a job he actually did on that. We also were working at that point in time in parallel. We joined the Australian Wildlife Health Network. That was seen as a critical thing for GameCon to be involved in, because what the Australian Wildlife Health Network looked at was disease transmission in wild populations. As hunters, we harvest wild animals, we bring them back and we feed them to our families. So it is critical for us to understand that we are not bringing a diseased animal back to our families if there are disease outbreaks, and we need to know what they are, where they are, and what impact that will have on us. We were able to get quite a lot of people in the scientific community aligned with us there because we were a big help to them. One guy came along to the Wildlife Health Network and he was trying to do DNA research on foxes. So we were able to mobilise hunters to collect DNA samples for him. The Office of the Head Vet were looking at whether chronic wasting disease actually existed in red deer populations in Australia. GameCon was able to organise deer hunters to collect measurements and samples to send back to him to prove that we did not have chronic wasting disease. They were looking at, there was a DNA mapping process that was done for rooster deer on the south coast. We were able to assist them with that as well. And then when H5N1 was the big one there a few years later, just after the Game Council was formed, the Australian Wildlife Health Network and the links that we'd established with the scientific community then got hunters involved in the collection of samples, and we collected so many samples for them and actually had to ask us to stop. I still remember talking to the guy who was in charge of that down at Geelong. He had a budget for samples to come back, and he was worried because he'd received so many samples from shooters across New South Wales and Victoria, but he'd never received an invoice for the mailing. And he was worried that all of a sudden he was going to get an invoice for like, $20,000 for postage, or a collective of invoices, $20,000 for postage, and he only had a budget of like $5,000. And I said, don't worry about it, they probably volunteered the postage. And he said, well, who does that? And I said, well, a group of people you're working with. And I said to him again 2 years later, he said, you know, I've still never got a single receipt from anyone for postage for any of those bird flu samples. And I said, then I'd probably close it off and spend the money on something else, because I don't think you're going to. But from a point of view of a scientist, he was not used to working with people who are prepared to spend, in some cases, some of these people, several $100s of their own money, mailing things back to him to get tested and never expecting any money back from it. That was an interesting little, I guess, side discussion. But they're some of the things that GameCon was working out in the background. We also helped the green sea, I can't remember the exact name now, but there's a group in Queensland working on recovery of the green sea turtle. And we put them in touch with a couple of hunting groups up North Queensland to try and work on a way to shoot pigs off the beaches, because pigs go out, they're a major predator of turtle eggs. So, you know, all of these things were going on in the background right across Australia, things that we were building and things we were putting together. The Game and Felon Control Act was put to Parliament around 2000 and debated and passed. And then the Game Council was formed, and I was fortunate enough to be a councillor in the initial Game Council, and then a number of other GameCon delegates were too. George Court was another that immediately jumps to mind. And then we set up the hunter education programs, the public land access and so forth, and then proceeded to enjoy our hunting on public land. The people who were represented on the Game Council from GameCon, all three chairmen of the Game Council, Robert Brown, Robert Borzak and myself, all came from GameCon. Other councillors were Stephen Larson from GameCon, Doug Shoup, Doug Young, George Court. So there were 6 or 7 of us that came out of GameCon onto the Game Council, and that continued the link that was initially established between the first proposal and all the work that had been done to line the hunting clubs up to get that up and running, because that link was established, and once it was established it was never broken. Because once we got the hunting clubs and the organisations lined up, once we got their eyes open, they were 100% behind that process. And one of the things that we did right back in the early days, a transition step from I guess the meeting in the Wanangata and the other discussions we had, and the Cree Party getting lined up. We had a meeting at St George Rowing Club. There's 25 or so people there. I chaired that meeting. And what we did was we ran through the concepts of what we had discussed down in the Wanangata. And what we found was that there was not a single argument in the room. There were some points of clarification. There were some people that came up with some really good ideas. And that's one thing that has been GameCon's strength, from when it was Joint Committee Recreational Hunting Associations right through to now, is that you go there with a concept, an idea or a process you want to put in place, and you throw that into the Brains Trust. There's some very, very clever people on that, and what you get back from that not only is good feedback and support, but you also get some incredibly good ideas, insights that actually change or help you to structure the argument going forward. And as a discussion, as a forum group, as a workshopping group, GameCon was invaluable in getting the final process that became the Game Council actually in a format that the majority of hunters actually would accept. And it was largely the feedback from those people that helped us get around some of the small pitfalls and traps that may have turned hunters against it in the early days. One of the things that was unique about the constitution of the Joint Committee and GameCon that followed it was a restriction placed on the executive that the only activities, the only work they could actually push ahead with or proceed with were matters that had been brought by a member group and had been actually voted on and approved by GameCon. So when we brought the concept of public land hunting to it, that had to be debated, and GameCon had to be voted on, had to be approved, then the executive were allowed to push it. It was physically impossible for a chairman or a secretary or a vice chairman or someone like that to direct, to actually say, well, we're going to do this from here on, right? That cannot happen. It's unconstitutional the way GameCon's set up. So what happens is everything has to come from the member groups. Now, that doesn't mean to say a chairman can't come and float an idea, but if that gets torpedoed and sunk, they can't proceed with that. The only thing that they can actually push is what the member groups have agreed to, and it's best, or certainly the way that I ran it as chairman for the 15 or so years that I was chairman of GameCon, was that it wasn't up to me to bring the idea. It was up to me to sow the seeds for that idea, to get ADA or whoever it was, Nepean Hunters or Blue Mountains Field Sports or someone to actually put that idea forward. If everyone thought it had legs, everyone thought it had merit, they would all vote and say, yes, we'll go ahead and do it. Then you knew you had the support of everybody at that table, that when you went to a minister or someone along those lines as the chairman, and you made the argument for whatever it was to get up, you knew you had the support of the group that was sending you there. And people had the right, if they disagreed, to withdraw from that, and any correspondence that went in then did not mention that organisation's name. So people had the right to buy in and buy out. But you're 100% right, Doug, it was driven from the bottom up. And that was the big thing that a lot of the early delegates that come along there simply could not get their head around, was the fact that they had this organisation that they were in charge of that represented 60-odd thousand people, but they couldn't preside as a president. They had to chair and manage the group collectively and do what collectively the group wanted to do. And that's why we have a chairman, not a president. And really that very nearly brought us unstuck a couple of times with some of the stronger personalities in the early days until people got their head around how that actually worked. And that as a model, I believe, is unique. And again, I'll come back to what Don Brooks in the early days of that. That was one of the things that he put forward as a base concept of that it could not be directed from the top. It had to be run from the bottom. GameCon is really at a crossroads at the moment in its future development. It really, I believe, needs to get to a point where we have either a full-time or a part-time paid employee. I can speak from personal experience, the sheer workload involved in running an organisation like that. You're looking for a volunteer anywhere from 15 to 30 hours a week of your own time to make that function, to make it work. The way that I guess society's going these days, that ethos of the volunteer isn't quite there the way it was in the past. Not many people I know have the time to do that. I mean, I certainly don't have the time to put 15 to 30 hours a week in anymore. I did that for 15 years. That is just hard yards. But where I believe it needs to go, it needs to remember that base philosophy, the thing that actually got it formed. It needs to get a greater buy-in from the member organisations. In other words, I'm not aware, I haven't been there for a couple of years now because I've been having a break, but the member organisations need to get active and they need to start to drive the association again. Because GameCon is an organisation that if it starts to wallow or stagnate, the only reason that can happen, the way GameCon is set up, is if its member groups are not pushing the agenda. Because the only way an agenda gets there is through a member club or a member association. So they're the groups that have got to bring that, they've got to put it forward, and then they've got to put the resources behind it to make it work. But we have our public land hunting now. We have a game licensing unit which is doing quite well. We have a firearms review at the moment that worries me. I haven't been just worried about a review of firearms regulations since Howard's laws in '96, the way that that's going. We need to mobilise our our constituents to fight that a lot harder. We need to make sure that we are the first port of call for the government when it comes to discussing or liaising, consulting with people in the hunting community about issues that relate to hunters. We were at one point with the Game Council because of the direct link. If anything came through Game Council, it came back to GameCon. GameCon was the think tank that then fed the ideas back to the Game Council. So that loop has largely been broken now because the council at the moment for the game licensing unit is advisory. They're not running it as we were. So we need to get that relationship re-established and very clear with government departments, and we need to get back in the game in respect of politics. But again, that comes from the member organisations because the executive of GameCon cannot invent these things themselves. They can't go off and do something themselves. They can only do what the member clubs tell them to do. The Shooters and Fishers Party is a key element, a key plank of our future as hunters and shooters in New South Wales. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But we can't have all of our eggs in one basket. We do need an active political process from the clubs and associations. And the most important thing is that can't seem to be or become in some way an adversarial relationship between the clubs and the Shooters and Fishers and Farmers Party. They've got to work collaboratively together, and they're two sides of the same coin, and if they work together, if they liaise with each other, if they transfer and exchange information correctly, then what we'll wind up with is a very effective lobbying model in New South Wales. The problem we've got, a couple of the large organisations at the moment going their own way and in some respects putting their self-interest in front of everybody else's best interests, that it has a potential to break down, and that would be heartbreaking to see that happen, especially given that we've spent 25 years now in New South Wales working very hard to try and get everyone together. For that to unravel would be a very hard thing to bear, without a doubt.
Well, Don Barton's my name. I guess I got into hunting because primarily as a boy I was interested in fishing. And the old Outdoors and Fishing magazine used to have a lot of articles in it on recreational hunting. That got me interested because really hunting and fishing are very much similar activities in pursuit of your quarry, and you're out there on your own in the natural environment, and you're guided by certain ethics with regard to conservation of the species you might be interested in hunting or fishing for, and also wanting to ensure that there's some future to that activity for other generations to be able to enjoy. I first got involved in organised hunting activity, or rather organised hunting clubs, after a chance meeting with an old workmate. We'd worked together as teenagers in the mid-60s at Everleigh Loco Works, Vic Brinkley, who was one of the founding members of Nepean Hunters Club. And after meeting Vic, I thought I really should join a club, because the only way we'll get a future worth having is to organise amongst ourselves and be in groups like that. And so I went along to a meeting of Nepean Hunters Club where we had reports on the activities of this body known as the Joint Committee on Recreational Hunting, which then later on became GameCon. Moving forward fairly quickly from that, we had Barry Unsworth's foray on recreational use of firearms, inspired by a belief owing to advice from a Richard Farmer liquor merchant and strategic policy advisor, that Labor would get the votes of blue rents ladies in key marginal seats who didn't like people having firearms. Of course, it never seemed to occur to the Labor Party that a lot of people interested in hunting and shooting were blue-collar workers, and that they were in fact mounting an attack on their own constituency. Between then and Port Arthur, we had the increasing threat looming over our heads. And what happened with Port Arthur was there was a huge influx of members to the Nepean Hunters Club. I think at one stage it got up to about 700 members. And I preferred being in a smaller body, so we started our own small hunting club up in the Blue Mountains and affiliated with GameCon. And I then regularly attended meetings as a representative of Blue Mountains Field Sports Association. And what made it viable to have a small hunting club was that we could be a part of a body like GameCon, and you could go there and you would be treated with as much respect as you would have, as if you were the head of, say, ADA or the representative of ADA, quite a large body. That made you feel that you were able to contribute, and importantly also able to get information about what other people were doing, what we were interested in trying to do together, and you could take that back to your own body and give people that sense of involvement. So that was my involvement with GameCon and our club's involvement with GameCon. I was actually aware of GameCon, and I think I might have attended a couple of GameCon or recreational, I do beg your pardon, joint committee or GameCon meetings as a delegate or an alternate for Nepean Hunters at some stage. I'm just not entirely sure about that. But certainly once we had our own club, I was there pretty much all along as a delegate. What has struck me with hunting, and to a certain extent with things like fishing and with the sort of recreational shooting movement, is there's this continual clash, this two tectonic plates there of opinion, where there's one group that always seeks to be inclusive and to move the general body along and to try and coordinate with people and treat other people with respect and listen to other people's ideas. And then there's the other group that tend to have a kind of tribal commitment to their own body, to the exclusion of all others. Their idea of unity is domination, and in a similar fashion they seem to spend too much time inside their own heads and have all these brilliant ideas that everybody else should just immediately fall into line with, and there's no question of dialogue or having respect for other people's thoughts or even trying to understand other people's ideas. And this to me seems to be a great tragedy of recreational hunting in particular, that you had people, for example, criticising aspects of the Game Council when it was formed, who made no attempt to inform themselves as to the rationale for the things that they found so objectionable. It was just shoot from the hip straight away, and it's a really destructive attitude that we have to discourage. Yes, there was a very clear explanation of the rationale there that made sense. It was to do with animal welfare, where you've got deer that have a clear, regular breeding season. It made sense to have a closed season when there were young deer at foot, because no one wants to see a very young deer lose its mother and be vulnerable to predators like wild dogs or even foxes. Not to mention the possibility of dying a slow and lingering death from malnutrition. That wasn't possible with deer like sambar that don't have a clearly defined regular breeding season. So the explanation was there loud and clear from the very beginning, and yet you've got this attack on it from people who, again, haven't bothered to inform themselves of that rationale. Now, the information's been freely available to Blind Freddy for a long time, and I think what we're really looking at is another seam in the recreational hunting movement, and that is you've got the shooters who just want to drive around on private property spotlighting things. Anything that you're able to shoot, you should shoot, and anybody who wants to say, hang on a minute, there might be other ramifications to what you're doing. That person's just being a pain in the neck because they like being a pain in the neck. On the other hand, we've got the other group who understand the whole idea of recreational hunting and conserving the species that you like to hunt in reasonable populations for the future, but managed in such a way as to avoid them becoming a threat to the environment or a problem for the primary producer. And that's what game management's actually all about. It's about maintaining that balance between keeping your species around that you want to hunt for the future, but also looking out for the legitimate interests of other people and the environment. And you have these people that just want to shoot things. They're not interested in the tradition of hunting, they're not interested in the culture of hunting, and they're not even interested, as far as I can see, in stopping to think for a moment and trying to inform themselves or to work things out. And that's a real problem we have, that shoot from the hip group in the hunting fraternity. I think there's been a slow growth in that direction. I think the development of more recreational hunting clubs has helped get the word out. There are recreational hunting clubs that may not be entirely in tune with that. For example, if you look at the Firearms Act and regulation, to be a police approved hunting club, if you're a small hunting club, you have to be affiliated with one of the bodies that are recognised under the statute as bodies with which you're affiliated to get police approval. And one of those is the Australian Pistol Association. And I'm not knocking the Australian Pistol Association, they're a worthy body of people. However, you have to ask yourself, are you allowed to hunt game with pistols? You also have bodies that are affiliated with full bore clubs that have got recognition as hunting clubs, and they're not in the mainstream of information flow. It's been very difficult to get people from clubs with that linkage to actually get with the core part of the recreational hunting movement and access the information that's available and engage in dialogue that would result in a much better outcome and much more unity amongst people interested in recreational hunting. A lot of state government departments have ministerial advisory committees of one sort or another. The Minister for Agriculture is the Minister administering the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, and he has or had set up Animal Welfare Advisory Committee or Council, I forget which it was, and they would promote ideas to the Minister that in some cases he might run with or she might run with. Nobody else was in a position to know what sort of advice these councils were giving the Minister, because most of the people on the Animal Welfare Advisory Council came from an animal rights or an animal welfare background. Apart from the farmers, there were really no other bodies involved that with interactions with animals who had an interest in animal welfare who were part of that body. And thanks to the Shooters and Fishers and Farmers Party, or the Shooters Party as it then was, recreational hunters managed to get an observer status on that body through GameCon. And it was then that we were able to have someone there at the point of advice to the Minister being developed who was able to operate with a bit of a capacity for mounting a reality check. Although they didn't have a vote or anything like that on the committee, they could speak. That committee then had to pull its horns in a bit with some of the advice it was giving. There were a few issues that got away from us before we got in that position. One, for example, was the criminalisation of the use of remote-controlled training collars on dogs, with the clear implication that this was a cruel thing, and so the statute deemed it to be cruel by making it illegal. Yet at the same time, the importer of the collars was able to take action against the RSPCA in the federal court, seeking an injunction preventing the RSPCA from alleging that these things were cruel. And the court, taking the trouble that the state government did not take, to listen to evidence from experts in electronics and Zoology and Veterinary Science granted the injunction prohibiting the RSPCA from making these allegations about the collar. Also, what happened was the animal welfare people were prepared to endorse collars for training dogs, remote control collars, that emitted a spray of citric acid. And anyone who knows how sensitive a dog's smell is must know that there is a real issue of animal welfare with the use of a collar like that. And yet that was considered to be fine. So you can see the irrational nature of policy and legislation development under the influence of these people. From the point onwards where there was a hunter representative on the, as observer rather, on that committee, nothing like that happened, because there was both the farmers and the hunters there to try to maintain some common sense in the whole thing and to have proper regard to real issues of animal welfare. So that's an example of how important that is. If that committee is revived, it would be important to have that sort of representation on it again. I particularly have in mind too that would be important for people involved in recreational fishing, because I can remember a situation on that committee where one person held forth vehemently against some celebrity chef because she proposed that they would euthanize a lobster by putting it in the freezer, and everybody knew that what you should do was to immerse the lobster in an ice slurry. And you're there thinking, well, the bloody lobster's going to be dead anyway, and you doubt very much whether there's enough difference between, you know, suffering hypothermia in a freezer and suffering an ice slurry for it really to make much practical differences to justify this highly emotive indignation about, you know, so-and-so proposing that the lobster be euthanized in a way that's not absolutely politically correct. So for people that like fishing, they have to remember that catch and release fishing has been criminalised in Switzerland and in Germany. And yet that seemed to be a big ethic in recreational fishing generally. And you have to wonder about those contradictions and what might happen to recreational fishing if that were banned. The fish resources in New South Wales are under a lot of pressure, and if catch and release were criminalised, then it would probably do a lot of damage to fish stocks. From the recreational hunting point of view, I think it was a fantastic thing that the Shooters Party did for us to get us that representation there. I think you'd have to say that there's so much going on at any one time, and so many government initiatives impacting on recreational outdoor people that you're never going to get on top of everything the government's up to at any one point in time. But GameCon does allow a big step forward on most issues, and it is a great place for people to swap information and also to make others aware of issues that are on the boil that may affect them adversely. And there was a major concern with the closure of Crown roads by the present state government, which was just proceeding ahead at breakneck speed. And there were roads being closed, for example, that gave you access, useful access to parts of state forests and things of that nature. And the closure of those roads would have led to the state forest being much more difficult to get into. So these things are all important. I think too, GameCon provides you an opportunity to see what other clubs are doing. I have to take my hat off to the ADA. They have always impressed me, in New South Wales at least. I haven't had much to do with ADA Victoria, but ADA New South Wales have always had a very open, inclusive attitude towards other hunting groups. It's through GameCon that I've heard about various things the ADA have been doing, and we've been able to participate in those too. Not so much as a club, but just encouraging our members to sign up for things like courses in the use of dogs in hunting deer in woodland and this sort of thing. getting roped into finally doing my waterfowl identification test by, I think it was people from Australian Hunters International. It's when the different bodies work together like this and help lift the whole standard of competency and interest in recreational hunting across the board that it works really well. And that comradely sort of attitude from key hunting bodies, particularly the larger ones like ADA, towards other hunters who are members of smaller clubs or perhaps not even members of clubs at all, is really the way forward. And the idea of forming your own little tribe and living in your own little cave is just ridiculous, and that's not going to advance recreational hunting one iota. Well, I think what strikes you most about the GameCon meetings is the bottom-up nature of them. You don't have someone trying to set the party line, as it were, and everyone has to fall into line with that. But very much listening to different points of view about various issues, and also hearing about initiatives being carried out by other groups that are really going to take things forward one way or the other. It helps give us a roadmap for the way we'd like to go forward. It's certainly been a source of information about things such as the various issues relating to properly regulated access to public lands for recreational hunting. It has also been useful in promoting interest in genuine issues of animal welfare. It's helped cue us into the availability of courses and the like being run by constituent bodies of GameCon that our members might like to go to. So it's been a very, very useful vehicle for these things, and it's also given us a good grounding in where we should be looking at going as a small group, with limited number of people, of course, and limited number of ideas and contacts and that sort of thing. I would recommend to any small hunting club that they affiliate with GameCon in order to access information, ideas, support, all these things that are so important to making your own small group more viable than it would be otherwise. Yes, I think what you'll find is there are a few people that have a very bowdlerised understanding of GameCon. They think they know all about it. And what you're really looking at is that old relationship that all sorts of sages have commented on, about the relationship between confidence and ignorance. And the people who know least seem to be very confident that they know all. And that's why we wanted to make this video, to document the reality of what happened and the history of what happened. My first degree was in modern history, and I have a real interest in trying to have balanced and accurate history and historical records. And so we hope this video might be part of that. And it might help just quietly set the record straight compared to some people's perpetuation of gross misunderstandings that perhaps suit their immediate needs and personal objectives that distort the record. If they disagree with anything in this video, well, they can go ahead and make their own. Exactly. But I doubt they'll get the support to do it. Well, I think we want to see GameCon, after all the damage caused by the abolition of the Game Council, with that hatchet job done by Steve Dunn. Now that we're regrouping after that and getting our bearings again, I'd like to see GameCon getting back to what it was doing before it had to deal with all the damage control, and before it had to deal with a lot of time wasting caused by a particular body getting involved for a while, which is really one of those cave-dwelling bodies that just wants to build up its own corporate interests and doesn't care about recreational hunters generally. Now that we've put all that behind us, I'd like to see us move forward in the way we have previously and keep doing what I think we've done so well in the past.
My name's Doug Young. Been hunting since I was 16, which was way back in 1960. Had the opportunity to go up onto my sister's place up at Mudgee and bought my first firearm in those days from Mick Smith's, and I still own that rifle. It was a Winchester 92. Then after a few years I sort of didn't get access out to Mudgee anymore. Got married, had kids, the usual stories. Then the mother-in-law got married again to a chap lived down at Annabinnaby, and I had access to a property down there, so I started hunting again and got my son interested. Then one day I was out at Horsley Park Gun Shop and there was a sign up in the window, want to learn about deer hunting, and I did. So that was my first sight of ADA. Went along to the meeting in October 1989, which was the first meeting that John Mumford stood up and said, I'm your new president. I was sufficiently impressed. I've stayed with ADA ever since then. Came on the committee itself a couple of years later and became the state secretary at the time. And the natural thing to do was to support your president, so I started coming along to the joint committee meetings. And I've stayed on and felt that it's made a decent and useful contribution to hunting in New South Wales and to sensible firearms laws. Would have been 1991 at the latest, maybe even 1990 when I first came along. One of the first things I can remember was we made a submission to POCTA, the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. It got debated for quite a while and the submission was put in. And about the same time they recognised that this POCTA was also part of the Animal Welfare Advisory Committee. And it was recognised then that maybe in some way, if we could get on that, it would be of some use to hunters and hunting. And after much lobbying, we eventually got onto there as an observer. And it's been useful to us over a number of years. Well, probably like most organisations, we might have started off a bit light on, but since then we've put in some very good submissions. Certainly when Steve Larson was with us, with GameCon, he does some tremendous submissions, and they're real quality items, and we've tried to maintain that standard ever since. No, at one stage we'd all put in the same submission, and as we've since found out, it was just simply counted as one, same as letter submissions and that type of thing. So we've gone to the system where, okay, we'll put out sort of a list of dot points for the various clubs and associations to make use of, and then they put in their own submissions. So we're all working off the same list, but can vary the submission a bit, and so it adds quality and variation to the submission. And also, being a group, we can come together and somebody will pick up on a point that some of the others have missed, and that way we can cover most of the points and aspects that are required for a submission. Well, certainly George Court's had his moments. He's contributed on occasions. He's probably like me, he sits back quietly a lot of the time, but when he comes on, he makes a very strong contribution. Other chaps that are around at various times, John Kell was another one from the Colonial Muzzleloaders Association. He was very valuable and gave a lot of advice to us. One of those chaps been around for years, very keen on hunting and shooting, and I'm sure he would have helped John and myself over the years. Robert Brown, of course, is a major contributor to anything and everything that GameCon has achieved. Other chaps, such as yourself, have all made their contributions and helped the organisation. No, there's nothing else out there, and it represents a good organisation for smaller groups and the larger groups to come together where we can sort of share information, share our differences, try and resolve them, but still recognise that every club has their own ideas and concepts and the way they want to operate. But understand that overall, all hunters have to be united, and GameCon is the best body to do it. Well, GameCon's a very useful organisation where all the clubs can come together, hunting and shooting, and even at some stage we had dogs clubs as well. In the future, I reckon GameCon will get back to its original core standards. We've suffered a little bit in the last few years with a little bit of sideline issues, but get back to our core issues and spread the good word on hunting, not only within hunting but within the community itself, and become an effective lobby group with the various state and federal governments. An organisation well worth being in. As I said before, you get a chance to share ideas, learn ideas, get advice from some of those that have been around the table for a while, and even just to raise the standard within their own club. No, I've seen no apparent opposition to ADA. I'm sure that on occasions we've appeared as sort of the big gorilla in the room, but I think most of our policies and suggestions have been readily accepted by the various member clubs, and they've supported them. We've never really sought to be the dominant group, maybe just one that comes up with some of the more common ideas. We don't try to dominate. We accept and recognise that each club has one vote, and it's a united organisation where the majority rules, not just the big one.
My name is Douglas Shoup. I first got interested in hunting when I was probably 9, 10, reading Outdoor Life magazines, hunting magazines, and slowly became more and more interested, read lots of books, and went on my first deer hunt when I was 15 with the city attorney at the time. My father wasn't a hunter. My brother is a lot younger than me, so it was just basically up to me. I pretty much self-taught. When I was about 16, 17, I got to know one of the local blokes, a year or two older than me, who had a ranch, and we started hunting together. Sage chickens, rabbits, ducks, deer, and went off to university, sporadically did a bit of hunting, and moved to Australia, and nothing. Lived in a big city, long way away from hunting. So I just thought it was not an option. I didn't even know that there were deer in Australia, for example, until one day I was at the Australian Museum, and they had a display up on the wall, and there were actually a population of mule deer in the north coast. Just around 95, somehow I became aware, and the European Hunters Club started going along to that. And I thought this was very interesting because you could network and ask questions about where to go, so on and so forth. And then Port Arthur happened, and then I started getting a thought in my mind that people needed to be more politically active. And a word you used to hear a lot at Nepean Hunters Club was apolitical, and I slowly began to realize that people didn't really understand what apolitical meant. They were interpreting it as you had no political opinion to be expressed at a club meeting. I thought, these people are crazy. The government's made it political. Our survival or lack of survival is politically driven, so why wouldn't we want to be political? And so I decided to get involved in the club, and I was secretary, treasurer, and eventually became president for a couple of years. And when we had club meetings, there'd be reports, and Ron Thomas primarily would stand up and give a GameCon report, and I'd scratch in my head. And so I slowly started asking questions about what this GameCon was, and I couldn't get much of an information. And I don't know if it was concurrent or before or after, but I bumped into John Mumford at a SHOT Show at Penrith. And we had a meeting of the minds there, and I think that might have been the impetus where I started even asking more pointed questions and wasn't getting answers that satisfied me. So I went along to a GameCon meeting, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, holy mackerel, there are people that see what the problem is and are doing something about it and want to talk about it. And so I started going to those meetings. And originally, I'd just sit there and listen, because there are all these acronyms flying around, AWAC and this and that, and every few minutes I was stopping Robert Brown and saying, what does that mean, who they are? So I must have been a bit of an annoyance, I would imagine, but for at least a year and a half I sat there just trying to absorb information so I would have an informed position to make statements from. I think I must have been there, and then when the Game Council was really starting to look like a real possibility. So we just got involved in writing submissions and supporting the Game Council in various ways. I went along to a couple of things like the Australian Environment Foundation, because the patron at the time was Don Burke, and he was promoting concepts of utilizing wild animals like rabbits, for instance, for akubra hats and kangaroo meat. And he thought that people should be able to have Australian native animals as pets, for example. And so I thought, well, you know, this sounds promising. I ended up as a councillor for a couple of years on the Game Council, was appointed by the minister, and through connections we became aware that there was a Commonwealth Farms Advisory Council being formed, and I was appointed by the minister to that. And if it wouldn't have been for GameCon, I wouldn't have even been considered for that advisory role. Commonwealth Farms Council is quite interesting. We actually had some regulations passed. What it was about was we had to deal with a backlog of a bunch of regulations that had been sitting there since John Howard days. And one of the things that got done was customs at the time were forced into the position if a firearm part came across the border and it was a part full of fully automatic rifle or a semi-automatic or a single shot rifle, it was treated as the highest category. And so they would stop it at the border, confiscate it. And so one of the things we got turned around was that paradigm, where if a part was for a lower level classification of a firearm, it was deemed that instead of the higher one. Another one was really obscure. Australia had a rule, regulation, whatever you called it. If you wanted to do research into armaments, weaponry, you couldn't get a permit to do it unless you had already been doing that type of work. And we got it changed to where a startup company could become involved in that. So it would have been a big thing if somebody in the future wants to set up a company to research and develop weapons and military goods. Same sort of thing. Once I got involved at GameCon, I was treasurer, secretary, vice chairman, with John Mumford as chairman, and then I was chairman for a few years until David Baker, came on. And I just see GameCon as a real, genuine peak body that treats everybody the same, values everybody's opinion. It's a real clearinghouse for ideas. And when there's an issue brought up and we can see a way forward to doing something about it, we put our ducks in order and try to, try to do something about it the best we can. I think it's fair to say that GameCon is a think tank. In fact, some people have criticized it as being talk fest, but talking things out achieve a lot. It, first of all, clarifies what the issues really are. I think somebody's mentioned before that some people have strong opinions with little information. It takes time and effort to invest in finding out what the issues are. And GameCon's a good forum to do that, where you can talk things out and discover that you didn't know a few things that you thought you did. And as a natural process, you come to a conclusion that everybody can buy into. But I see it as that as a think tank and a bottoms-up type of organization, and this, what's been mentioned before, the one vote, one delegate, really democratizes the whole process. I'd like to think that GameCon had a central role to play in the formation of the Game Council, support of the Game Council, and even still, while not as actively, but we still provide influence, direction and stuff very rarely, but it does happen where we can feed back to the game unit something that we think could be improved or not, and I think we get a fair hearing because we have a history and they know who we are and they respect us. Well, over the years we were focused on the whole thing about the Game Council and operation of the Game Council, getting into more for us, how to deal with all that sort of stuff. And now we're sort of left in a vacuum where the Game Council has become just like any other government department, basically. I see us as moving forward to where we become more of an activist role, where we engage in lobbying and submissions and funding research. Well, clubs have got a lot of work. People that haven't been on a club executive don't really realize all the work that goes into it. I mean, whether it's the sausage sizzle or whether it's doing the books, entertainment, it all takes time and effort, and it's all volunteer, people work. So I think if a club was starting up, there'd be a huge benefit, or even a club that's been around for a long time that's maybe stagnating a bit, to become involved with GameCon, and you would be able to facilitate and acquire information through the... GameCon's got a huge network of people. If you got an issue or a question, well, we know somebody that we could refer you to help you out. Well, we have a personal relationship with Robert Borzak and Robert Brown, and anytime we want to know something, we can invite them to a meeting or ring them up, and we can have open and frank conversations with them. And same sort of thing, because there's been a trust level built up over the years. I just wanted to advocate and protect the cultural pastime of hunting on a broad scale. Float all boats, and it's like a snowball rolling downhill, isn't it? The bigger and faster the snowball gets, the better it is for everybody. And, you know, this whole thing about the school excursion model of controlling feral animals in national parks has just been a gargantuan failure. We knew it was going to be. we could see it plain as day, but other people see things differently, and so that's what went down. But hopefully, I think it's very interesting, like the left wants to talk about the precautionary principle. You hardly hear that anymore. Like the precautionary principle for X, Y, or Z. But when we could prove statistically 1 million days of hunting on public land and state forests without an incident, and somehow that didn't relate on national parks because somehow, some way there might be an incident, and you relate to that to other things in our lives about international terrorism, for example, and the precautionary principle apparently doesn't apply to that, but it applies to hunting in national parks, and yet the same people are arguing both ends of the scale.